Good morning, everybody, or good evening. I guess it is 7:30 at night. Wow, there's a delay on here. I forget how much of a delay there is. How is everybody doing? I first have to apologize for doing this on a Friday night instead of on a Thursday night. You guys know that I normally do these on Thursday night, but something came up last minute that took precedence. And I thought I'd talk about that a little bit because yesterday was kind of exciting. I got a message Wednesday morning from Richard Bobo, and he just happened to be driving through my town, oddly. Okay, so now I've got a whole bunch of people. Hello, Pucolo, Rory, Helicopter, Jared, and Alessandro. And, yeah. So, afternoon, that means you must be pretty much on the other side of the world, I'm betting. Anyway, so Richard gets a hold of me and says, hey, you want to meet up for lunch? It's like, yeah, sure. What are you? I'm driving to Texas Tech. Said, hey, can I drive with you? Ride with you? So, Richard and I had an epic road trip yesterday. So he got here about 10:30 in the morning, and we pretty much spent the rest of the day in the car going to Lubbock, Texas to pick up a sousaphone. So get this, we had on the trip back a sousaphone, an ophiclyde, a bag of crumb horns, and parts to the subcontrabassoon. So, yeah, that was, it was, really fun, and I thought about vlogging the whole thing, and I never turned on the camera once. Yeah, so you guys got to miss out on the epic nerdiness that ensued from Richard and I, from Richard and I's epic trip. So, I'm gonna. A few things pop up there. So, did I say ophiclyde? Yes, I said ophiclyde. Ophiclyde. Yeah, this is my ophiclyde here. I've done several videos on it. I may do some more. But yeah, I have an ophiclyde. We had a photo session when we got back of an ophiclyde and a sousaphone next to each other. But the other question, Pucolo said, what are the subcontrabassoon joints made out of? You mean one of these? I have my very own subcontrabassoon joint. This literally is one of the joints of the subcontrabassoon that Richard has given to me. It was one of the test prints. The final version will be in 3D printed ABS plastic, as Jared said. This one is not in ABS. This was a test print, and I can't remember which other type of plastic it is, and Jared, you probably remember. But this, it's in the works to get a serpent. It is in the works, Alessandro. I'm going to be looking to get a 3D printer for Christmas, and we're going to start having some fun there. But anyway, this is the subcontrabassoon joint for the low B. This is the low B tone hole right here. And, yeah, PLA, that's right, Jared. So this is in PLA. This is the test print. And the reason I have this particular joint is Richard was deciding what to name the joints. And this one is named the Newton joint. Because my Symphony No. 2, Forest of Dreams, is the first really major composition that's not like a chamber work or anything that uses a subcontrabassoon. And the low B natural is the most important note that the subcontra bassoon has. So, yeah, this is the Newton joint of the subcontra bassoon. This is not, of course, the final joint. This was a test print. But I've got this here. It is kind of, I kind of like Happy Good. It makes me happy. Also, I got a Gigareed. So, that's cool. What part of the subcontra bassoon is this? This is the low B tone hole. So the key that'll cover it's the low B flat key. It is going to, it's part of what will be on the descending part of the bell. There's going to be one more joint below this. One more joint below this, and then the bell. So you got tone hole up here, then the tone hole here for B flat, and then the bell. So this is actually the, I think Richard said this is the single largest joint on the subcontra bassoon, to give you an idea. And the only reason it's the largest is the other joint, the one that has the B flat on, it's just a hair shorter by a few millimeters, but that's it. All right, so tonight's topic is trombones. Trombone. And with all the nerdiness that we already, how tall will it be? I think Richard has it at about 6'4". So it's not. I have the first time Richard came to my place, he brought a mock-up of it. Just a very rudimentary kind of proof of concept, and I was able to hold it, and it's not as big as you think it is. It's big, but I was like, oh, this is like human scale. This works. So it's only a couple inches taller than I am. Will the subcontra bassoon keywork be made out of 3D printed plastic too? No. The only thing 3D printed are going to be the largest joints like this one. And I think he said it's like 17 joints like this have been 3D printed. The smaller joints will not be 3D printed. Those are going to be milled out of Delrin. And then all the keywork is going to be metal. And all the support structure will be stainless steel. Okay, so let's talk trombones. Last week we talked trumpets, week before that horns, so might as well get to trombones. Should I get my trombone off a shelf from over there? No, I'm not. All right, first, so I know there's probably going to be lots of subcontra bassoon questions, and remember, I am not Richard. I just am friends with him and have part to it. So, if anybody has any trombone questions before we start, let's go ahead and get them out there in the room now. And if not, we can just start talking basics. And remember, guys, there is like a 20 to 30 second lag when I talk to when you see. Opinion on valve trombone. I have played a valve trombone a couple times. They have their purpose. There are certain pieces that you really should be using a valve trombone for. All the Verdi operas are for valve trombone, and that's not just the cimbasso part. Pretty much every Italian opera of the 19th century was valve trombone. Dvorak, all his symphonies were valve trombones. So there's a place for them. There's a piece by Georginescu that actually specifically calls for valve trombone against regular slide trombones. So it has its place, but by and large, the slide trombone works. It is probably more versatile. What do I think of the Superbone? I think it's too much. You can do one or you can do the other. Doing both at the same time requires an amount of coordination that I don't think most humans are capable of. Yeah, and it's left-hand valves too. So I mean, if you're a horn player, great. But it it's a Superbone is a gimmick. So anyway, let's just start talking basics of trombone and talk about a little bit of the history. Trombone is one of the oldest chromatic brass instruments. Um, so into we can trace the trombones back into the Renaissance era. Um, okay, is that the trombone that was made for James Morrison? James Morrison has a Superbone, but the original Superbones were made for Maynard Ferguson. So way back then, like the 70s. What do I think about Thayer valves on triggers? I don't have enough of an opinion on Thayer versus Hagman versus traditional rotary valves, or even versus piston valves. I think that's all going to be a player decision, and that's not something that is up to a composer to even think about. So anyway, let's go all the way back to the Renaissance era, and we've got everybody's favorite musical term, the sackbut, which is derived from the French to meaning to push and pull. When I say the first trombone was made, it's probably in the 1500s. So going all the way back then. And the earliest trombones, the sackbuts, are... This is probably the orchestral and band wind instrument that has changed the least. I could go grab my tenor trombone off the shelf, and it's not too much different from a Renaissance or Baroque sackbut. One of the things that changes over the years in trombone development is the instruments just get bigger. So the earliest sackbuts have a bore about the size of a modern trumpet, and they play higher, easier. They use a different mouthpiece. In fact, the mouthpiece that I use on my Ophicleide here is also a sackbut mouthpiece. So it's very, very much smaller than even a typical small trombone mouthpiece. And I've got both a small trombone mouthpiece and the Ophicleide mouthpiece sitting in the case over there. Actually, let me grab them real quick. So yeah, this is the Ophicleide or sackbut mouthpiece, and this is a Bach 6.5 AL. This is a standard beginner mouthpiece. It's a small bore mouthpiece, and you can see that there is a considerable size difference between the two. This one is much less volume. Yeah, not as funny as... Well, yeah. I mean, you've also got the old term for the bagpipes, which was called a doodle sack. Bet you didn't know that one. Anyway, so the old sackbuts were very small bore. Their bell was only about 4 inches in diameter, maybe 5. And this was basically the instrument used up until Mozart, early Beethoven. Bombardon comes from a French organ stop. It was the lowest organ stop, the bombard. Related, I think, to Bourdon as well. But anyway, you'll always learn something here. I know too much about instrument history. Anyway, so through Mozart, the instrument, the sackbut, is pretty much the same instrument. By the time we get to Beethoven, though, players are looking for bigger instruments. Also, so one thing to think about. At least through early Beethoven, all sackbuts or trombones are coming in multiple sizes. So you've got your standard tenor, which is pitched in B flat or C, just depending on who makes it. And it plays a standard tenor range. You've got your bass, typically in F, sometimes in E flat, sometimes in G, which is a very long instrument, about 6 feet long without the slide extended. You've got an alto. One contrabass was ever made that's like 9 feet tall without the slide extended. And there are very, very few rumors of sopranos. We don't know really much of soprano trombones until the late 1800s. So there is some mythology there in soprano trombone usage. Anyway, so we get to Beethoven. Now, Beethoven, if you look on the page, it says alto trombone, tenor trombone, bass trombone. This is exactly what Mozart used. This is exactly what Haydn used. It is... when Bach used them, which was very, very rarely, that's what he used as well. How would one play a contrabass sackbut? With the slide, there's a very long handle, so that when you're in close position, you don't need to worry about the slide. But as you get further and further out, you have to use a handle, so that'll give you about this much more extension on your reach. And it was not a good design, and the handle was used on bass trombones into the 1970s with the G bass, and we'll get to the long true bass trombones here in just a little bit. But we do need to talk bass trombone by the time we get to Beethoven. Interestingly, so by the time we get to Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, maybe not the fifth, but definitely by the ninth, the bass trombone changes. And this is where we start getting one of the most confusing things in organology. What is a bass trombone? And with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the bass trombone used was a tenor trombone, except its bore had been expanded so that it had the same bore as the old bass trombone. It would have the same kind of sound, but it wouldn't have the same low notes. If you look at the part in Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, the part of the bass trombone never goes below where a tenor trombone can play. This is very unusual. So we think that Beethoven was scoring for a B-flat bass trombone. And this is the beginning of where we get what's called a tenor bass trombone. It is a tenor trombone with a bass's bore. This is going to become a very important term throughout the 1900s. The 1800s, tenor bass trombone. Now, we're going to skip Beethoven aside. We'll go and look at a couple of the other German composers. Weber, Schumann, Schubert. When they say bass trombone, they mean a bass trombone in F. Big, long instrument, long slide, because they are writing notes below what a tenor trombone can do. So it depends on where you're writing and who you're writing for, what instrument you're writing for. Now, this is what's happening in Austria and Germany. In France, though, we have a very different situation. In France, in the 1810s, 1820s, the trombone nearly goes extinct. And this is a fact that's not well known, and it's not well documented either. But there was a time at the Paris Conservatory that the trombone studio only had about 3 players in it. This is compared to the Serpent studio at the same time. The Serpent had 20 players. So in all of France, there were 3 trombonists being trained, but there were 20 Serpent players being trained. This is the state of the trombone when Berlioz comes onto the scene. So Berlioz comes onto the scene in 1830 with Symphonie Fantastique. Hey guys, welcome to the stream. We're talking trombones tonight. So anyway, so Berlioz is concerned about the state of trombones in France, and he starts working with the trombone studio. He goes and he teaches some of the trombone players how to do things that they didn't know were possible. For instance, nobody in France knew up until Berlioz that the trombone could play the fundamental, the pedal tone. So Berlioz says, "You can play that note." It's like, "No, we can't." "Yes, you can. Here's how you do it." But that note's there. And so Berlioz starts introducing the pedal notes. Now, interestingly, in France, because of this dearth of trombone players, the bass trombone is gone. Berlioz actually speaks pretty derogatorily of the bass trombone. Remember, this would have been the old F or E flat bass that's as tall as I am. He scores for bass trombone exactly once, and it's optional. Berlioz does not score for bass trombone ever again. Symphonie Fantastique is for 2 tenors and an alto trombone up top. The alto trombone after Symphonie Fantastique goes away, and it's all 3 tenor trombones. And because the tenor trombone is so ubiquitous in France, all they do is just write trombone. And so every French composer from Berlioz through Ravel is writing for only 3 tenor trombones, with a couple of exceptions. Vincent d'Indy will write and add in a contrabass trombone. A couple times, Camille Saint-Saëns will add a bass trombone and a contrabass trombone, but this is very, very rare for his stuff. And I'm trying to think. I think there is 1 or 2 other pieces in that about 100-year span that will use a bass trombone, but otherwise French only use 3 tenor trombones. Everything in the French literature is meant to be played on tenor trombones. Germany is different. Germany is still trying to hold on to alto, tenor, bass. By the time we get to Wagner, so we're looking 1850. Let's just give it about then. Wagner says, we need to get rid of that damn alto trombone. It doesn't do anything. And so orchestras are getting rid of the alto trombone. You will still see it in scores, though, in Germany. Every Brahms symphony is alto, tenor, bass. Every Bruckner symphony is alto, tenor, bass. That said, we don't think either the Brahms symphonies or the Bruckner symphonies were ever played with an alto trombone. Now, there's one other thing we have to talk about, that's the introduction of the valve at this point. So, I think everybody here knows a trigger trombone has a valve for the left thumb. This lowers the fundamental from B flat to F, or sometimes another tuning depending on just the tuning of the extra loop of tube. This comes about in the middle of the 1800s. This gets added to that tenor bass trombone that we have all the way back with Beethoven, and so we now have a tenor bass trombone with an extension, and this becomes the bass trombone. It can now play all those missing notes that the long bass trombone could do, but the short bass trombone couldn't. With one note exception. This instrument could not play B natural below the bass clef. It could do everything else, but it could not play B natural without some trickery. So this instrument is now what gets called the tenor bass trombone. By the time of Wagner, if you see tenor bass trombone, it is a large bore tenor with an F attachment that can play the bass notes. And what happens is this instrument takes over the entire section of trombones. So all of Wagner's operas, except The Ring, it's tenor bass trombones on all 3 parts. All of Mahler's symphonies, except Symphony 6, are tenor bass trombones. Trombone is the only cylindrical brass instrument that I don't have any aesthetic grudges with, and I'd love to see ATB sections in contemporary context. It's not unheard of. Trombones. We'll get to scoring for trombones here in just a little bit, sweeter, and hold on to that thought, okay? So as I was saying, all of Mahler's symphonies, except for 6, are written for the tenor bass trombone. So, but there, we go back to Wagner again. Okay, so I'll get to that. Alessandro. So, Wagner, in the Ring, introduces a new member of the trombone family. He remembers that old contrabass sackbut from way back in the Renaissance era and says, well, let's modernize this. Let's make a contrabass trombone, 1 octave lower than the B-flat tenor trombone. Wagner's not really the person to do this, though. And so the idea of the contrabass trombone by the time of Wagner's Ring is not unique to Wagner. We can also find it in a score of Camille Saint-Saëns that comes out 1 year before the premiere of Das Rheingold. So Saint-Saëns, we can almost give the credit to scoring for contrabass trombone first. Saint-Saëns' instrument is coming out of Adolphe Sax's factory and is a valve contrabass trombone, which gets further taken to Italy, where Verdi likes it, and it becomes the cimbasso. Wagner's instrument, however, is a massive double-wrapped, double-slide instrument. So instead of 2 parallel slides, it's now 4. And this contrabass trombone will get used in opera houses primarily because they have to have this instrument if they're going to play the Ring. And Richard Strauss will use it occasionally. Schoenberg uses it in Gurrlieder. And it's one of those, it kind of stays there hidden. And only within the last 20 years, 30 years maybe, has the contrabass trombone become accepted. But let's go back. So we got through, I mentioned that Mahler 6 is the one exception to the tenor bass rule. Mahler 6, he specifically scores for a true bass trombone. The question, though, is what kind of bass trombone is he writing for? Is it the old F bass? If so, the part can't be played on it unless it's an F bass with a valve, which is possible. The other option is that in use at that time was a F bass with 4 valves and no slide, essentially a cimbasso. We know that the Vienna Philharmonic used this instrument. We have actually video footage of the Vienna Philharmonic using it. If you go find the video of Georg Schulte recording Siegfried's death, Siegfried's Funeral March. If you look, the contrabass trombone they're using is an F bass with 4 valves. And this may be the instrument that Mahler used in the 6th. It may also be the instrument that Richard Strauss used for trombones 3 and 4 in an Alpine symphony. There are people who argue that the lowest trombone part in the Alpine symphony is a contrabass. It's not. It has to be done on a bass. So at this time, everybody has pretty much abandoned the alto trombone 50 years ago. And then Schoenberg says, it'd be a good idea. Let's bring the alto trombone back. And so he starts scoring for the alto trombone in Pelléas and Melisande and Gurrlieder. His student Alban Berg follows him in Lulu. I don't think it's in Wozzeck, but it's in the 3 orchestral pieces. And then nobody else really follows Berg. So the alto trombone has this brief moment of glory again, and then it's gone. Okay, so Sweeter asks, the bore is different between true basses and tenor with triggers, though, isn't it? Not as much as you think it is. This is something that when I was writing volume 3, I put a graphic in there. And so let's go ahead and talk about the bore size. Tenor trombones come in 3 distinct bore sizes: small, medium, and large. The small bore trombone is used primarily by beginners and by jazz players. The medium bore is kind of a student model instrument. This is an instrument that will typically have an F trigger. The small bore does not have an F trigger almost ever. The large bore is what most professional orchestral trombone players are playing. The difference between the small bore and the large bore is greater than the difference between the large bore and the bass. The difference between the large bore and the bass trombone is actually very small. So much that this is a small bore tenor trombone mouthpiece. This will not fit into a large bore tenor trombone. But a large bore tenor trombone mouthpiece will fit into a bass trombone. If you look at the diagram in volume 3, you'll notice that the difference between a tenor and a bass trombone is almost imperceptible when you actually see a graph of it. And this is a graph I did with the exact measurements. So there are some players who will use a large bore tenor trombone for a bass trombone part, providing they use a bass trombone mouthpiece. And they will do this for smaller works. So they're going to do something like this for works like Mozart, Beethoven, works where you don't want this overpowering late romantic trombone sound that can just crash through the orchestra. There you want the little bit larger bore. All right, so back to trombone history. There's one more step in trombone history that does not get talked about often enough in textbooks, and that is the development of the contrabass trombone in the 20th century. So every orchestration textbook you'll ever see, except mine, will talk about the contrabass trombone being in B flat, pitched 1 octave below the tenor trombone. Except that's not the instrument that players use. Players are using an instrument in F. So the contrabass trombone in F is the same fundamental length as the old long F bass trombone. Except it has a substantially bigger bore, a bigger mouthpiece, and 2 valves on it. This means that this instrument can play right down to the bottom of the piano's register. The theoretical lowest note of that instrument is, I'm not even sure. I mean, it's just going to depend on the valves. It can at least go down to the B flat, down at the bottom of the piano. A flat are there, but they're going to get really weak. So, this instrument is now really the bass trombone that's used. It's an instrument in F and not in B flat. Anytime you ever see a contrabass trombone, with very few exceptions, it's going to be the F instrument. There are a couple of companies still making the giant B flats, and I know most of you have probably seen Trent Hamilton's videos. He has a B flat contrabass trombone. Those are the minority instruments. Most players don't want to touch those. They want the F instruments because they're a little bit smaller, they're more nimble, and it's only a single slide instead of the massive double slide. Now, there is one other tradition that needs to be followed, and that's the British. So, the Germans abandoned the long F bass trombone sometime in the late 1900s. We're not exactly sure. We have composers asking for the true F bass trombone. Brahms asks for it. There's one. I have one score by Alexander Glazunov from the late 1890s where he specifically asked for F bass trombone, which is very unusual for a Russian score. But by and large, the F bass trombone is gone by 1900. Few are left, which makes there's if you don't know, there's a famous bass trombone passage in Bartok's Concerto for Orchestra that can only be played on an F bass. It's a glissando from low B to F, and it can only be done as 7-1 on an F bass. That instrument had been extinct for 50 years, basically. But let's talk the British, because the British have something very different. They have a bass in G and pitched a step higher. And nobody's exactly sure why the British chose a bass trombone in G. It's smaller, it's a little easier to play than the F bass or the even bigger E flat bass that you see occasionally. But it can't get the low C and the low B that's called for in so much of the German orchestral literature. The famous bass trombone part in the chorale of Brahms' First Symphony can't be played on the G bass trombone. At some point, a few G bass trombones will get fitted with a valve that will lower it to D, and so the instrument can now play all those notes, but those aren't as common of instruments. Typically what you find are the straight instruments that are about 5 feet tall, about a foot shorter than the F basses. But here's the thing, these G basses survive a long time. Bootsy and Hawkes keeps making the G basses up until the late 1970s. And those G basses are actually pretty highly sought after by collectors from the late run of Bootsy and Hawkes. Because they're really good instruments and they can still be used. They still have a handle on them that you need to use to get out to 6th and 7th position. Unless you're a giant player and you take the handle off and you can actually do it with your arm. I'm 6'2" and I can't do it. I do have a friend who's a trombone player who's 6'8" and can. So there's that. But the G bass is a very different instrument. So we'll talk about it without the trigger. It'll go down to a C sharp below the bass clef. Great place to look at how to write for the G bass trombone is go look at the planets. Holst was a trombonist, and he knew the bass trombone very well, and his bass trombone part lies so beautifully on the bass trombone. I mean, you can just see the slide positions and how he's thinking about that. It's a fantastic study on how to look at that. I think Trent actually has 2 G basses now. He has one that was his grandfather's, and then he picked up another one that's even older. Neither of his instruments, though, have the valve on them. Now, one thing about the G basses is they are small bore. They are not much bigger or any bigger sometimes than a small bore tenor trombone. So this small bore tenor trombone mouthpiece could fit into a G bass trombone. It would be an interesting experiment if a company like Wessex could resurrect the G bass trombone. They absolutely have the technology and the tooling there. It's just a demand. And I've talked to a Wessex representative, and it's like, yeah, they could do it. It probably wouldn't be that difficult. And it's an instrument I would love to see starting to get used again. Just for its own individual timbre. It's one of those, it rattles. It doesn't have the same kind of warmth that our modern bass trombone has. It's got a cutting edge to it. So that's a little bit of the history of the trombone. Let's go move on to some scoring stuff. And We'll start off with really our typical section. Either in an orchestra or a band, it's really about the same. It's 3 players or 3 parts: tenor 1, tenor 2, and bass. A lot of times it's going to be marked as trombone 1, trombone 2, trombone 3, which is fine, but I find that if you're just marking the part as simply trombone, that tells me you're not thinking, is this going to be played on a tenor or on a bass trombone? So I always mark my parts as a tenor trombone or a bass trombone, notating which instrument I specifically have in mind. So every piece of mine will say tenor trombone. It won't just say trombone. And that goes from pieces I write for very young band to all the way up to symphonies 2 and 3, which are as advanced as you get. How much do the different mouthpieces affect the tone of tenor versus bass? Considerable. So when I was band director, we did not have a single bass trombone mouthpiece in the district. Yet we had 5 bass trombones. I don't understand how that logic works, but we had 5 bass trombones, no mouthpiece. But the player could use a large bore tenor trombone mouthpiece. And it said, okay, this mouthpiece fits, it's fine. This was not a school band program full of band nerds. Nobody knew the difference. So I order a bass trombone mouthpiece. And it finally comes in, and I gave it to the guy playing bass trombone at the high school. Said, here, this is a bass trombone mouthpiece. And he was typically a tuba player. He was not a trombonist, so he's a tuba player. He put the bass trombone mouthpiece on there. It's like, whoa, this is like a different instrument now. It actually would play the low notes. He wouldn't have to struggle so much to get the low notes. So this part back here is the same. This part is different. Particularly the inside is so much bigger. And so, yeah, he got that, and it immediately changed his sound and how he played. And it became louder, too. So, yeah, if you've got your typical section, it's tenor, tenor, bass. Now, in a high school group, you're still going to have the one bass. But if you have more players, they're all going to be playing tenor. So you get this weird situation where you've got like 2 kids on first, 2 kids on second, 2 kids on third, but only one of the kids on third is on bass. So you've got a kid on bass trombone and a kid on tenor trombone playing off of the same part. And this becomes difficult for balance reasons. And this is a pedagogical thing that the composer has to think about, but can't be ultimately fully concerned about. This is sometimes why I will go ahead and write 4 trombone parts: tenor, 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 bass. So typically a high school band will have at least 3 tenor trombone players and a bass player. 4 trombone players in a high school band, not unheard of. In fact, it's super common. So have 4 parts, done, not a big deal. Unless one of those players is super weak, and then they want to double up. Interestingly, what I have found is your strongest players in high school in the trombone section are typically your first player and your last player, because the last player is focused on bass trombone. And because they focus on bass trombone, typically they are going to have a different set of technique. And it's just a different, it's treated as a different instrument, even though the part may not reflect that. Yeah, when I played horn, I like to have both fairly shallow and relatively deep cut mouthpieces for different contexts, so I assumed it made considerable difference, as you said. Yes. Is there an E-flat contrabass trombone? As far as I know, there is either 1 or 2 E-flat contrabass trombones that have been made. They were custom instruments. They are not standard, though. And that's the thing with brass instruments. Because it's just pipe, you can create new monstrosities in the workshop. You don't have to go with what the manufacturers provide. So, creative creative instrument repair techs can make an E-flat contrabass trombone, but it's not something you can go out right now and purchase. So it's typically, if you're getting a contrabass trombone, it is in F. All of our trombone players are weak. Yeah, that's I can't really comment on that. I've been in orchestras where the trombone players were weak, and that was kind of sad, really, because when the trombones are the weakest section of the orchestra, it's like, I could play louder on my bassoon than you're playing on trombone. Come on. As we get to more professional groups, we can start thinking about adding in an alto or a bass trombone. Since about 1980 or so, players have really kind of said, okay, if the part says alto trombone on it, I better play an alto trombone. This is not universal, but it's becoming more and more so among professional players. So something like Beethoven 5 will be done on alto trombone, or Schumann 3. Beethoven 5, by the way, super difficult on a tenor trombone because it goes all the way to a high F at the top of the treble clef on on an alto trombone. I know you talked about alto, but what about soprano? Okay, soprano trombone is interesting. So we have some soprano trombones that get made in the late 1800s. Most of the soprano trombones are getting used by the Moravian church tradition. The Moravians had this wonderful idea for church services. They would incorporate a trombone choir. And so they're really kind of the genesis of trombone choirs. Well, in order to play the soprano part, they had a soprano trombone made. The problem with soprano and higher trombones is slide accuracy. As you get smaller and smaller, the slide positions get smaller and smaller. So that on a tenor trombone, the distance between first and second position is about that much. Half that now for a soprano trombone. And that's the difference between B flat and A. You've got to really be accurate, and the level of accuracy means that a lot of the parts are not going to be played in tune. And so when I talk about the soprano trombone in my book, I say it's mostly a novelty instrument. It can do glissandi, and that's really the only advantage it has over a trumpet in the same range. It's the same range as a B-flat trumpet. Trombones in E-flat, a sopranino trombone, and a piccolo in high B-flat have been made, but think about that the soprano trombone's first and second position is this. The sopraninos is this. The piccolos is this. You're talking about half a centimeter. And so it's kind of pointless at that point because you don't have fine enough motor control to be able to operate the slide to that level. I saw a soprano trombone in a small band store. Yeah, I mean, you can get them easily for a couple $100. That would also be for a double slide tenor. Yeah, double slide tenors, though, are novelty. They don't really serve a function other than, look at this toy I've got. There were one or two early New Orleans jazz players who used soprano rarely. Yes. I want to think that Louis Armstrong may have for a while. Um, and did Big Spiderback? He might have. King Oliver did. King Oliver did. So high-ended trombones are inconsistent with the lower consort. No, not necessarily inconsistent. They just become far more difficult to play. Um, the accuracy of pitch on the soprano and higher trombones is just not to a level where it can be acceptable in professional groups. This is why you don't find soprano trombone listed in any orchestral works, with very, very few exceptions. I think I know one or two pieces of highly modern music that call for him. There may be Hans Jakob Hespos that may have a soprano trombone. There might be one or two others, but that you just don't see them. There a Penderecki piece, maybe. But yeah, they're novelties. They're too small to be accurate, and the trumpet can do such a much better job in the same pitch range. Honor Dufresne, I think, played soprano once, maybe just appeared in a photo with one. Alto trombone is fine. Alto trombone is about as small as you can get with a slide mechanism and still have a double slide mechanism, I should say, and still have fine control over tuning. So basically, you need to be a robot to play soprano. Kind of, yeah. You need to have that kind of mechanical robotic control over the slide because, I mean, this is the distance between slide positions. Not impossible, just difficult. Okay, so back to the band section. We can pretty much rule out using soprano, trombone, or higher at this point. But alto and bass could become fair game at some point. Like I was saying earlier, by about 1980, the top professional players are using altos again. And interestingly, now we've got Chinese-made altos. And here's the funky thing about the Chinese-made altos. It turns out they're really good. Like, I've talked to players to say, yeah, I bought this $90 Chinese alto trombone, and yeah, it plays nearly as good as a top of the line whatever. It's like I don't play alto trombone enough to justify paying $3,000 for a top of the line instrument, but for $90, $150, I've got one that works nearly as well. So we've got this instrument now, these Chinese-made trombones that people are saying, yeah, these work. These play really surprisingly well. Huh. Okay, so we've got alto trombones that work now. Should alto trombone be written in alto clef? 99.99% of the time, yes. There are a few rare instances where alto trombone will not be written in alto clef. And those instances are if you ever write a pedal note for the alto trombone, you would use bass clef. Otherwise, alto trombone is in alto clef all the time. Period. End of story. Amen. Yeah, ST, you probably just missed what I just said. So alto trombone is always alto clef. Let's see. So band works that call for alto trombone. ST, you don't have to remove the messages. It's perfectly fine. The only time we need to remove messages is if they're insulting somebody. So don't worry about that. Alto trombone in wind band music. Don't worry about it, ST. So alto trombone in wind band music is was used in early 19th century. So we see it in the Mendelssohn works. Would you ever consider using treble clef for extended passages above the alto clef? No, there's no real need to. So you're really going up to E flat or F. So you're really only looking at three ledger lines above the alto clef. Three ledger lines is nothing. Typically, we want to change clefs if we get to 4 lines, and the alto trombone just isn't going to really get to 4 lines up. Is it a tradition? Since I've never seen a tenor horn, or horn for that matter, use it when playing in similar register. Yes, well, it goes back, we're going all the way back to the Renaissance era on this. So the tradition starts way back then. Trombones have never been transposing instruments. They've always been non-transposing instruments written at concert pitch. So tenor trombones are written in tenor clef. Alto trombones are written in alto clef. Bass trombones are written in bass clef. This was the tradition. You knew which trombone you needed by which clef was presented. The composer didn't have to write the word alto. Alto clef was there, and it was assumed. And we can see this if we go back. Look, Heinrich Schütz is a great composer to look at from the late Renaissance, early Baroque. Schütz is writing for lots of trombones in his cantatas and motets, and sometimes up to 5 trombones. And typically the first part's in alto, and so you've got alto clef, and a few parts in tenor clef. So going all the way back to the Renaissance, the idea of a transposing instrument wasn't there. Transposing instruments don't really become a thing until late Baroque era, early Classical. And even then, it's typically only going to be your brass instruments like your trumpet and your horn. They're written so that the harmonic series always just appears as the C major harmonic series. Bach's, the only time you would see something like that in Bach, so the trumpet parts, of course, are written with using the C harmonic series, but his open d'amore parts, which we would transpose as A, he writes at concert pitch. So the players would just use a different set of fingerings. The players didn't really like that. They wanted to use the same fingerings. So by the time you get to Mozart, we really see transposing instruments. Trombones never got that memo, though. And so all low brass are non-transposing instruments, unless you're in the British brass band. And for some reason, the British brass band decided we want to transpose all of our instruments, including all the tubas and the phonemes and the trombones, except the bass trombone, because the bass trombone's in G. So what about the clarinets? Okay, so the clarinets, that's going to be in between Bach and Mozart. Bach's not writing transposed instruments. Mozart is. So the clarinets come in between there. So the clarinets are really the first woodwind that really gets regularly transposed. Trombone, and that gets us into another thing. So talking with the clefs, alto trombone and alto clef, tenor trombone and tenor clef, so many composers forget this. The tenor trombone is a tenor instrument. There has been a push to keep pushing it lower and lower and lower, and you'll see the majority of tenor trombone music today written in bass clef, and written toward the bottom of the staff in the bass clef, where the tenor trombone starts getting pretty weak. Tenor trombone has a really good 2-octave range from B flat in the bass clef to the B flat in the treble clef. I think I played some Norwegian music where the tenor trombone was written in B flat treble. Yes, so these are what a publisher would call world parts. There are some European traditions where they decide to put the tenor trombones in B flat treble. Aside from weird band music, this is a tradition that nobody else follows. And so, and euphonium players are the same way. Euphonium players can't decide if they want to be a concert instrument or a transposing instrument. So when I was writing my euphonium sonata, I wrote it as a concert instrument because, well, that's how it should be. And then one of the players who's going to play it said, "Can I get a B-flat treble part?" I'm like, okay. So yeah. Anyway, bass trombone is the only trombone in the British brass system or any of the other band systems that is never transposed. It's always bass clef. A good rule of thumb, though, when you're writing for trombone, if the part can fit well within the tenor clef, it's a well-written part for tenor trombone. I usually favor the higher part of the tenor's range. I never got to play in ensembles with true bass trombone, though. Never mind alto. Yeah. So one thing about the instrument with the slide, the higher you go in the range, the less the slide has to move because the parts will start getting close together. So the higher you are, the more flexible you are. You only can sometimes have to go between first, second, and third position. Boom, boom, boom. Move the slide that much, and you've got nearly your complete, diatonic range covered up in the upper register. If you're down to the low register, you might have to be going this far. Not to mention if it's on bass trombone. So the lower end of the trombones tend to be weaker. There's another thing with bass trombone. Euphonium in tenor clef. Euphonium has been written in tenor clef before, sure. It's not common, but all top level euphonium players have to read tenor clef. It's not an option. Some people will tell you that they don't like it, but one of the things that with euphonium players is they will play very frequently bassoon and cello music, and because of that, the tenor clef is there. Since a B-flat bass trombone is a fatter tenor, would a fatter alto be an E-flat tenor? I don't know. Okay, so let me see if I can explain this in a different way to you, Helicopter. I like higher trombone parts that leave room for the tubas to play something in the middle range. Yeah, okay. So yeah, trombones should not be down at supporting bass instruments, which is so common in band music. Okay, so back to what Helicopter said. So we've got our modern bass trombone in B flat, the same pitch as the tenor trombone. So are they the same instrument? No. Here's how the best way to think about it. So we'll just take a simple bass trombone with an F valve. There is something called an ascending valve. This is in French horns, true French horns. The third valve is an ascending valve. You press it and it goes up a full tone. If we think about the thumb trigger of the bass trombone as an ascending valve, so think about it that the bass trombone really should have the valve pressed down the whole time. And only by letting it go are we now putting the instrument in B flat. With the valve pressed, though, we're automatically in F. So we got F, E, E flat, D, D flat, C, and we can't go much lower than that. Take the valve off, we're now in B flat. So if you think about it in its reverse function, that it's an F instrument with an ascending B flat valve, the bass trombone makes more sense. At least I think it does. let me know if that makes sense to you. Now, I said bass trombone with one valve. Most modern bass trombones will now have two valves. So one in F, and then the other typically is in G flat, which seems weird, but if you put them both down, the instrument's in D. So you can play an open B flat, an open F, an open G flat, and an open D, just by changing the valve combinations. Put the instrument in 4 different keys at once. Also, the thing, every time you put down a valve, you lose a slide position. So put down the F valve, instead of having 7 slide positions, you now have 6. You put down the G flat valve, it's the same. You put down the G flat and the F valve together to get D, you've lost another slide position, now you've got 5. Then the F bass trombone is the same pitch as the modern contrabass trombone. What would you propose to resolve this? What needs to be resolved? It's a contrabass trombone in F. Think of it the same way that the valve is just an ascending valve instead of a descending valve. So this is where brass instruments get confusing. You've got 2 variables. You've got length of pipe, which woodwind players understand thoroughly. Length of pipe determines how low the instrument is. You've also got, with brass instruments, though, bore size. So the bigger the bore, the lower it plays, the more it sounds. So you can make a small instrument with a big bore that sounds like the bigger instrument. So a bass trombone with a single F valve has the same amount of tubing as an F bass trombone without a valve. It just has a bypass in it that shortens the length of the slide. The same way that the contrabass trombone is the same length as the old F bass trombone, but it's got the same amount of tubing as a big contrabass in B flat. It just has a bypass valve. That said, there are some tonal differences between the valveless straight bass trombones and the bass trombones with the valves. However, you are not going to find many orchestral players who want to venture into trying to use a long bass trombone anymore. Very few will do it. A handful will. There are some pieces that absolutely require it. Bartok is a great example. You've got Impossible Glissandi in the Concerto for Orchestra, as well as the Miraculous Mandarin, the low B to open F. But yeah, it's a difficult concept to grasp. That yes, the bass trombone is the exact same length as the tenor trombone, but it plays lower. And so let's talk about that low range of the bass trombone. This is something that is getting really, really out of hand with a lot of modern composers. They keep pushing the bass trombone lower and lower and lower. In my book, I say that a good range of the bass trombone is B flat below the staff, so same as bassoon low B flat, up to F above the bass clef. So you've got a good workable 2.5 octaves there. It can go about a 4th or 5th in either direction from there. So a good bass trombone player can play all the way up to a high C above that, the C in the treble clef, if not even higher. And they can go, theoretically, actually all the way down to a low B flat on the piano. But as you get lower and lower and lower on the bass trombone, it gets weaker and weaker and weaker. So that I play in a swing band pretty regularly, and we almost every concert we have a bass trombone feature, and I sit next to the bass trombone player and we joke around a bunch, and a lot of these features will go down to that low F. So 4 ledger lines below the bass clef. And, you really want all that power down there. And he's good for about 3 counts on that low F. Now, this is a guy who's a professional level player, played with the UNT 1 o'clock lab band. He's got some chops. But he's out of air after 3 counts. Now you've got parts that keep going lower and lower. So the gold standard of bass trombones range is from B flat 1 up to about F4. Yes, if you keep a bass trombone in that range, you're golden. A great piece to look at for that, Franz Liszt. Liszt wrote a single work for solo wind instrument. And it is the Hosanna for bass trombone and organ. And that's the exact range he uses, is from B flat 1 to F4. And it's so unusual in Liszt's repertoire that he's got this solo piece for bass trombone. No other wind instrument, but bass trombone. So why not? But yeah, that's the range he uses. You don't, a really meaty low note is, Strauss's Alpine Symphony has trombones 3 and 4. So 2 bass trombones playing a G1 in unison. And that's really meaty, but it needs both of them together. I heard one of my tenor trombone friends hit that B flat 0 you mentioned. Tenor trombone cannot do that. The lowest a tenor trombone can go with a valve should be C1. There's not really a way they can play any lower than C1, and that's pushing it on a tenor. Now, this is really making a lot of sense out of the trombone stuff that was mystifying me before. Good. Unless you want to write a B natural, which is a false tone. Okay, so B natural it does not exist on any form of tenor trombone. So we're talking B natural 1 here. It's the B natural right below the bass clef. This is the problem child of the bass trombone. So with a single valve, the bass trombone can play chromatically down to C2, the C right below the bass clef. Then we can go into our pedal tones, which start on B flat 1. But there's a gap in between there. So the early valve bass trombones would have what's called a long pull on the F valve. That long pull was a slide that was extra long. You could pull it out and tune that slide to E, not E flat, but E. And so you put that down, and now instead of F in first position, you've got an E in first position, and everything is now half a step lower. And so it out here in long 6th position, which is really like a long 7th position, you've now got your B natural. So you have to prep that. Oh, I can go from a B natural out here to an E natural in first position. So I can do that glissando. But I can't do B to F. Tenor trombones don't have this long pull, so they just can't play it. Which is why the second valve was added. Correct. So the second valve was added probably about 1960. So all bass trombones really prior to 1960 had a single valve. Then they get the second valve added. Now there's 2 systems of double valve bass trombones. One is the dependent valve system, one's the independent valve system. The independent valve system is the newer one. So the first ones were dependent valve. You push down the F valve, put you in F, and then you push down the second valve and the first valve together. You could not push down the second valve by itself. So first valve and second valve together put the instrument in D. So you had an B flat, F, D instrument. Works absolutely fine. The other is the independent valve. With the independent valve, the second valve is independent, and it's tuned typically in G flat. So you can have B flat, F, G flat, D. Some players will tune the G flat valve to a G natural, but that's a player preference thing. If they tune to G natural, they lose half a step on the extended slide, which means they can go down to the B natural with 2 valves down. They can't go to B flat, which you can do with the G flat valve. I would love to play the trombone. So yeah, the valve combinations are always going to be up to the bass trombone players. I have seen players who will have even longer valve sections. I've seen a D valve. I've seen C valve before even. But those are kind of like gimmicks. I never tried to play them except briefly goofing around in the band room, and I've often considered getting an alto mainly for jazz. You know, I've got a tenor trombone. I'm looking at it right now. Oddly, when I was a band director, I would use my middle school's bass trombone as my trombone that I would use. Example, because I knew none of the junior high kids were going to play it. So I took it around with me, and the beginner kids loved seeing it because it was so much bigger. And so that's one of the things that visually it does look a lot bigger because the bell of the bass trombone is bigger. So a standard tenor trombone bell is about 7.5 inches. The bass trombone bell can be anywhere from 9.5 to 10.5 inches. I've heard some ginormous ones up to 11 inches, but that's overkill. Mouthpiece is probably still a little big for me, but I might be able to get a decent embouchure with time. Yeah, I have found that I'm not a great low brass player. Surprisingly, my best brass instrument, once I really got down to it, I could make the best sound on horn. So that worked well with my bassoon and woodwind embouchure. I'm getting a more decent sound most day when I play the ophicleide, but that has surprisingly a much smaller mouthpiece. Yeah, so let's see. Do we have any other questions tonight? Well, you know what I haven't touched on is the inclusion of contrabass trombone into modern band music. So we can talk about that a little bit. As of right now, I don't know very many pieces for wind band that call for contrabass trombone. Only piece I can think of right now that would be considered wind band is John Mackey's Fanfare for Full Fathom 5. Say that 5 times fast. Yeah. Do B-flat trumpets have similar size bore to soprano trombones? Exactly the same. B-flat trumpets and soprano trombones have the same bore and same mouthpiece. I was good at pedal tones on horn, but that's very different from every other brass instrument that goes low. Yes. I can imagine horn and bassoon embouchure not being terribly dissimilar. Firmness, yeah. But anyway, contrabass trombone, because what's better, 1 or 2 contra players? Always one. There's never any reason to have 2 contrabass trombones. What actually happens is when you get 2 contrabass trombones, a lot of times what you're going to have is phasing between the 2 because they're not going to be perfectly in tune with one another. And I've seen this from a friend who's a professional orchestrator. He got a recording of 2 contrabass trombones together, and what happens is the sound starts canceling one another out. So, um, yeah. So the sound of a single contrabass trombone is much more effective than two. Using alto and tenor, which one would take the melody? That's a tricky question. And it depends on um, what composer you're studying. So there's an odd tradition here. If so, go study Mozart's Requiem. Mozart's Requiem is great for its trombone usage. There's the big trombone solo in the tuba mirum. Tuba mirum spargiansonum. And I'm not a bass, so I can't sing the bass solo there. But the trombone solo that goes with it is the tenor. He does not give the alto the solo, he gives it to the tenor. So it's put into the second trombone part. Oddly, this tradition gets carried throughout a lot of composers. Go look at Rimsky-Korsakov. We know that Rimsky-Korsakov is scoring for at least 2 tenor trombones, if not 3 tenor trombones. Yet he always puts the solo in the second trombone. Russian Easter Overture, it's in the second trombone. Scheherazade, the trombone solos are in the second trombone. Just on the off chance that the first trombone is playing an alto, which we know was never happened. But then again, you look at something like Schumann's Third Symphony, where it's alto, tenor, bass, and the alto is absolutely carrying the melody there. So it just depends on context and function. It seems like contrabass would add a lot of color to a wind band since most of the contra instruments are pretty mellow in one way or another. It absolutely could, yeah. And I think that within the next 10 years we'll start seeing contrabass trombone parts in wind ensembles. I don't have really any doubt about that because they're now becoming accessible with instruments like the Wessex. It's like, okay, yeah, we've got a good working contrabass trombone that we can afford. It's like, hey, let's use it. I was at Texas Tech University yesterday. I talked to the tuba professor. They said, yeah, we've got a Wessex Chimbasso sitting in this next room. I mean, Chimbasso is essentially a valve contrabass trombone that can be played by the tuba player. So I don't see that having a contrabass trombone, whether it could be played on a Chimbasso or a regular slide contra trombone, will be something that your top wind ensembles will have too much trouble with. I know Dallas Wind Symphony, or Dallas Winds now, will use contrabass trombone on occasion. They did there's a couple of pieces by Edgar Varese that have contrabass trombone. They're not true band pieces. They're like integrals, I think, maybe equatorials, that will have a contrabass trombone, but they're not really a band piece. I've used contrabass trombone twice. I've used it in Symphonies 2 and 3. And that was one of the things when we were going to do the performance of Symphony 2. I already had the contrabass trombone player lined up. It was fascinating. I put a call out on the Contrabass Trombone Appreciation Society's Facebook group. Said, hey, we're going to be trying to play this piece. Is anybody in the Dallas-Fort Worth area interested in playing contrabass trombone? Within 24 hours, I had 3 people said, yeah, I can do it. And they all owned their own contra trombone. So it wasn't difficult to find a contrabass trombone player, which was quite surprising. Would a sub-contrabass trombone be a good idea? Not really, no. Sub-contrabass brass, anything, not really a good idea. Because there is a limit to how low the lips can vibrate. And it's as simple as that. You are limited to how slow your lips can vibrate. And you really just can't go much lower than what a contrabass trombone can already do. I watched a few old videos from Nick Drozdoff where he played his bass trumpet, and also his physics videos. I don't know those videos, helicopter, sorry. All right, so I've been talking for an hour and a half. Anybody have any questions over anything we've talked about tonight? Trombones or yesterday's epic road trip with Richard Bobo and me in a car for like 12 hours? Not 12, it was closer to 9 hours. Duh, coffee's cold now. Yeah, and if you didn't catch the beginning of it yet, I did not do the stream yesterday because I was on a road trip with Richard Bobo all day. So, but if nobody else, tubas next week. We should be doing tubas next week. Yes. And I'll try and do it on Thursday, though I can't make any guarantees. It could be Friday again. Oh, is next Thursday Halloween? If next Thursday's Halloween, I'll let you kids go trick-or-treating. I'll stay home like a curmudgeon. Let me check. What does the calendar say? I haven't even... Halloween is so off of my radar. Yeah, so next week we may just do Friday since it's Halloween. I literally have dressed up one time for Halloween since the 1980s, which is probably longer than most of you guys have been alive. So I'm all questioned out. Maybe I should start saving some for the end. Nah, it's fine. Sweeter, I know you got here a little bit late. I showed this at the very beginning, but this is my new trophy that I have. This is one of the joints of the subcontrabassoon. It's all mine. It's even named the Newton joint. This is the joint for the low B natural. So it's actually the largest joint on Richard's subcontrabassoon, and he printed off a copy for me. Now, actually, this was a test run made of PLA instead of the final ABS plastic. So, but yeah. So that's fun. Well, ask Jared. He should be in the room, helicopter. I know he did one on Saturday, but yeah, so subcontrabassoon joint, mine. But anyway, oh yeah, no, we talked quite extensively about it yesterday, and it is just because honestly, because it is so complex, it just has to go slowly. And I think Richard basically said he's doing it as financially responsibly as possible, which, yeah, I don't blame him. You know, gigging musicians have to be financially responsible. So, but it is going. I know where it is roughly in shape, and there's a lot going on behind the scenes that he's not shown yet. So, anyway, guys, this has been fun tonight. If nobody else has any questions, I will go ahead and call it an evening. It's 9 o'clock here. I've been talking for an hour and a half straight. And, yeah. So, I will see you guys next week, next Friday probably, for Tuba Buzz. And that's flugelhorns too. So, alright guys. talk to you later.